You know, I've played over 1,000 hours of Breath of the Wild and nothing was cooler than this moment. So, I decided to sculpt the coolest boss in the game, Cursed Naydra. But first things first, I had to take that doctor's handwriting sketch and turn it into something more legible. Now the first recording of the sketch was deleted, but luckily I got this key footage of me coloring in some rocks. And speaking of rocks, let's start building the base. I'm essentially going for Mount Lanayru here, as that is where our purple dragon resides during this secret boss fight. I'm building the bulk of the base with aluminum to save on clay, and I'm trying to get a general shape that's as close as possible to the sketch. And this is about as close as can be. Now I can cover it with clay to get a sturdier base to work with. I'm gonna use my tree branch to make this clay into as thin of a sheet as possible, but the tree branch only got me halfway, so I'll just do this. Nice. Now that we have our clay at optimal thickness, I'm gonna cover the whole thing and give it a quick bake so it retains its shape. With the clay baked and looking somewhat like a rock, I'm gonna add a thin sheet at the bottom, which will act as our spring of wisdom. As I was attaching it, I realized I needed 2 extra rocks on the side to make it look a bit more natural. After they were attached to the main base, I smoothed everything down somewhat so I could start adding details to the spring. I first started decorating the spring with tiny rocks and tiny columns before I finally found an excuse to play the game while I was working. I wanted to make sure the statue of the goddess and the path that leads up to it were relatively accurate to the one in game. Now sculpting the tiny statue of the goddess was quite challenging, as I don't usually work on such a small scale, but after a while it turned out quite good. After the base of the statue was done, I moved on to sculpt the goddess. I tried to get the scale of it as close as I could before adding the details and finally attaching her wings. Off camera, the tiny pillars on the side of the base of the statue came last, and I put in the oven to save my progress. I'm not sure what the Hylian religion is precisely called, but I have a feeling that putting their deities in the oven is not recommended, so let's just move on. Now I'm adding the entrance to the shrine that you find behind the Spring of Wisdom. This is also the point where I start to add rock formations around the spring to make it blend into the environment more and look like it's at the base of a mountain. And now I'm adding the tiny formation of ice right next to where the statue will go and some rocks to go around it. Moving on from the spring, let's make some ice. I made these to form silicone molds by shaping aluminum into a base, adding a thin layer of clay around them, and then adding texture. I made a few shapes and sizes before preparing the silicone. Alright, so here are the instructions. Who needs them? Alright, so let's just open these and... man, it's one of those things that's hard to open. Okay, this seems like a good idea. Moving on from that, I cast the mold and now we can finally move on to the dragon. I want to make sure I like the placement I had originally thought of, so I'm using some tape to map it out, and using that I can make an armature for Naydra's body. After I had a good blank slate, we can start adding color. Pick a card, any card. I'm going to be mixing these colors to get the rich, vibrant purple that's on Naydra's underside. And I'll mix these ones to get the lavender that will be under the stark black scales. With the colors mixed, I can attach Naydra's belly along the entire body, smoothing it out with a clear thing. Nadra's belly has this ribbed texture that I was originally planning to paint on, but after using the clear thing to evenly spread out the purple clay, I somehow got the perfect texture, which eliminated the need to paint it. Now I'm gonna bake it to retain the texture, and then when it's done, position the wire for the arms that we'll add on in a little bit. Before we add the arms, let's add the color for the rest of the body. I'm just spreading an even layer of that lavender color that we mixed earlier all over the top of the body. Then, once it's all on, blending it down to reach the darker purple. Alright, it's looking like a nice two-toned worm so far, so let's turn this worm into a worm with legs. I'm preparing a thin roll of black clay to spread over the arm armatures, and I'm sculpting them on the body, but I'm baking them separately and attaching them later. Nadra has 3 fingers and a thumb higher up on the wrist, so I'm adding those digits with some nice joints that I'll be able to attach some stunning nails to. Speaking of nails, let's go to the salon and give this dragon a manicure. To make those gangly claws, I rolled out a super thin sheet of purple clay and scratched it up with a wire brush. I cut small rectangles out, then used the wire brush again to taper off the tip of the nail. As those bake, I'm going to separate the 2 colors of the body with a long strand of black clay that's going to act as the beginning of Nadra's scales. And then to make it blend nicely, I'm going in with the steel ball and my favorite show must go on, I guess. Using these tools, I texture it on both sides and move on to sculpt the head. With a slightly rounded rectangle, I start adding wrinkles and other features until it somewhat looks like a fierce dragon. I attach 2 balls of clay that will act as the eyes, and I blend those in with a couple rolls of black clay. Hey, you heard it from him, not me. Nadra has a point though. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel and see more crafts from me. After you do that, all we need to do is add the tongue and shape the eyes a tad bit more. I'm attaching the head with this piece of clay because I wanted a bit more length and a slightly different angle, but we won't see this piece because I'm going to cover it with the thick scales on the nape of Nadra's neck. These will be painted black and purple later, so I'm smoothing them out a bit before baking to keep it all in place. And now for the gems on Nadra's back, tail, and head. I rolled up a bunch of different sized cones before freezing them for a little so I can make smooth, random cuts. I did the same thing with longer pieces of clay before baking them to retain their shape. Once they're done baking, I can attach them to Nadra's back and then add a roll of black clay around them to blend in later. And now begins my 12 hours of pure caffeine and misery attaching all these scales to Nadra's back. I tried making sure they were all slightly irregular sizes and shapes, but somehow all of them managed to make me wish I was back in the Forgotten Temple for the first time. With such a one-of-a-kind prize at the end though, I pushed through most of the tedious task. Finally, we can give this bald, George Costanza-looking dragon a sweet hair transplant of gems. Then I added Nadra's beard and baked it so I wouldn't damage it while I added the scales on Nadra's face. Once the face was acceptable on the scale, I blended the tail gems into the body using the same method as before. And with that, I have 100% completed the scale speedrun. Now we can attach and blend in the arms. As I was attaching the arms, I felt they needed a little bit more detail, and yes, that means more scales, but fret not, I didn't have to add too many. Wow, Naydra is looking quite scale-tacular so far, but we need to add the ears so he can hear my praise. To add the ears, I just rolled out some black clay, carved out the inside, and pushed in some lighter gray clay. And then to hide the seam at the top between the gray and black clay, I just overlapped some scales. After attaching those, I started painting the gems on Naydra's back and tail with this indigo color that I mixed. It was quite challenging getting a good color because the colors of Naydra change a lot during the boss battle, so looking back I could have probably mixed a slightly better, more purpley color, but I still think it looks really good. With the base of the gems painted, I'm gonna add some white highlights to give the gems more dimension and move on to paint the thick black and purple scales around Naydra's neck. Now at this point in the craft I was getting a bit antsy, so before I added the purple to the scales, I decided to jump back on the head gems, and once I finished, I realized the gems on the head and the gems on the body were completely different. I much preferred the softer white highlights that I did on the head, so I opted to accept my loss and repaint the gems on the body to match. With that correction, I was pretty satisfied with the gems and I began painting the eyes. Naydra's eyes are exceptionally beautiful with layers of blues, pinks, purples, and white, and I tried my best to capture them as they were something that enthralled me when I saw them in the game for the first time. For a final touch, I topped them off with a bead of UV resin to add that glossy texture that makes them come to life. While I have the UV resin out, I'm going to add a thin layer to all of the gems before going back to the scales and painting them with outlines of purple. With the painting done, Naydra is all finished, and finally the resin ice is all cured. This is a mixture of fake snow and clear resin which I cast in the silicone mold we made, and with all these cured, we can finally start working on the base. Because I don't want the resin to be put in the oven and have my house turn into a toxic gas chamber, I'm going to decide on the position of each ice pillar and sculpt clay around it so I can glue it in position when it's baked. After adding texture to the entire base, I realized I needed to add some malice to our dragon, but I wanted to make it removable so that way I can take it off or put it on depending on my mood. The malice was pretty easy to sculpt. I just used thin sheets of clay to which I added eyes, bubbles, strings, and some haphazard texture too. To paint it, I gave it a base coat of hot pink and slathered on some marbled black and pink paint. It ended up a mix between PewDiePie's trademark pattern and Ganon's malice, so I'd say job well done. After painting and adding details, it's time to paint and add details to the base by giving it a black base coat and dry brushing it with varying grays and whites. Once that's done, we can glue in all the ice pillars to their respective places. Using a mixture of tacky glue and fake snow, we can make the model look even more snowy by slathering it at the bases of all the pillars and wherever else it fits. Finally, after many hours of arduous crafting and bearing the risk of carpal tunnel, our beautiful secret boss is finally complete. And here it is. boy, that was intense, wasn't it? If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more things from Breath of the Wild, because it's one of my favorite games, so I will gladly do that. Check out my first video where I made a Stardew Valley craft and let me know what you think of that, and I'll see you next time.